Imagine waking to the faint whistle of the wind through cracked boards, a rising sun spilling orange light across a landscape so vast it feels endless. The air is already dry, so dry that your lips crack before you even speak, and dust coats your tongue when you breathe. This is the Wild West, where survival is a gamble and nature is the dealer. It's a world of grit, hunger, and unrelenting heat, where danger doesn't wait for nightfall. It's already sitting beside you at dawn. People often dream of the Old West as a place of freedom, adventure, and open skies. But the truth? It was a land that chewed people up and forgot their names. A place where clean water was rarer than gold, where a single toothache could end your life, and where the law was more suggestion than safety. Behind every romantic image of a cowboy riding into the sunset was a man too tired to dream, too hungry to rest, and too lonely to forget the sound of silence. Tonight, we'll take a slow journey through the reality of that world, the one hidden behind the myths. You'll hear the stories of settlers who rose before dawn, of miners who worked in darkness, and of wanderers who never made it back from the desert. We'll walk through the dust, the danger, and the exhaustion of living just one single day in the Wild West. And as the story unfolds, let your mind wander like tumbleweed drifting through the calm rhythm of history as you drift toward sleep. Before we begin, if you enjoy quiet journeys through the forgotten corners of time, please take a moment to subscribe to History for Sleep *. It helps this little corner of calm history keep growing. Tell me in the comments what historical eras you'd like to explore next, and when you like to listen, whether it's before bed, during a storm, or in the quiet of the early morning. Now, settle in. The wind outside has stilled, the fire crackles softly, and our story begins one step into a world where comfort is a luxury and survival is the only law. The first thing you would notice, waking up in the Wild West, is the air. It's heavy with dust, dry enough to sting your throat, and somehow cold and hot at the same time. The sun hasn't fully risen yet, but already it pushes against the horizon, stretching its light through the thin slats of a rough wooden wall. The world outside is pale gold and brown endless plains or cracked desert. Earth, and the only sound is the wind whispering through dry grass. You rise slowly, your back aching from the hard ground or a straw mattress that hasn't been fluffed in months. Your blanket smells of sweat, smoke, and the faint metallic tang of dust. There's no comfort in this morning, no gentle wake-up. The air bites, and your lips split when you yawn. You reach for the water jug beside your bed, but it's warm already, gritty at the bottom. Water is precious out here, so precious that people drink it cloudy and strange, hoping it won't make them sick. You pour a little onto your hands and rub it over your face, the droplets drying almost before they touch your skin. There are no bathrooms, no soap, and no luxury. You simply endure. Outside, the town or camp or ranch is coming to life. The squeal of a windmill turns in the distance, pumping what little water there is from the ground. A horse niggers. Somewhere, a dog barks once, then falls silent. The smell of smoke drifts in from a nearby campfire where someone's already cooking breakfast, probably beans, maybe old bacon, something simple and hard-earned. The sounds are sparse, but they echo far because the world here is so open, so empty that every sound carries for miles. You step out and feel the heat beginning to press down. The Wild West sun doesn't rise gently. It climbs fast and burns without mercy. Within an hour, the air will shimmer with heat, and every movement will feel heavier. Your boots crunch on hard ground, dust rising with every step, clinging to your trousers, settling into your skin. There's no escaping it. Out here, the dust becomes part of you, your clothes, your food, your breath. If you're a ranch hand, your morning starts early long before daylight. The cattle don't wait, and neither does the work. You saddle your horse by touch, the leather stiff and cracked from the heat. The animal snorts. impatient but loyal. You mount up, and the two of you head out toward the herd. A dark line on the horizon that needs moving before the sun makes everything unbearable. The sky above turns brighter and brighter until it's almost white. You squint against it, the brim of your hat your only shade. Sweat forms fast and disappears faster. If you're a prospector instead, your morning looks different, but feels the same. You wake near a shallow stream. If you be lucky enough to have one nearby, your tent thin and torn. You cook a few beans over a weak fire, swallow some water from a canteen, and check your tools. Each pan, each pickaxe is worn smooth from use. Hope is the only fuel that keeps you going. You've been digging for weeks, maybe months, and all you have to show is a handful of dust and a few glimmers of mica pretending to be gold. Still, you go on. Out here, giving up means death. And if you read just passing through, a traveler heading toward nowhere in particular, you wake with the ache of saddle-sores clothes that haven't been washed in weeks, and the faint terror of not knowing where your next meal will come from. You check your horse's hooves, look at the horizon, and pray the next settlement isn't too far. There are no maps that can save you from the Wild West's sheer indifference. It doesn't care if you live or die. The land doesn't remember names. By mid-morning, the sun dominates the world. The landscape glows with heat. You can see it rising off the ground in faint ripples, turning distant shapes into mirages. Every breath is hot, and the inside of your mouth feels like sandpaper. You begin to understand why so many people here aged before their time. Their skin, their lungs, their eyes, everything wore down. The Wild West demanded every drop of strength, and still it wasn't enough. You find yourself thinking about how quiet it is. No hum of machines, no chatter, no traffic. Just wind, insects, and the occasional cry of a bird. It's a peaceful kind of silence, but also haunting. It makes you feel small. You realize how far you are from everything, how far from safety, from comfort, from the world you once knew. Out here, the morning doesn't bring freshness or calm. It brings warning. Another day has begun, and already it's testing whether you'll survive it. As the sun climbs higher, you tie a rag around your neck, damp it with what little water you can spare, and brace yourself for the long, blistering day ahead. The Wild West has no mercy, and it doesn't wait for the weak to catch their breath. Every sunrise here is a challenge, every breath a test. You might think you could survive it, but the truth is, the day has only just begun, and already it's winning. If there's one thing that decided whether a person lived or died in the Wild West, it wasn't a gunfight or a bandit attack. It was water. The clear, unremarkable liquid you take for granted today was the most precious thing in that vast, merciless land. You could have a horse, a rifle, a sack of gold, but without water, you'd be gone within days. The West was filled with stories of travelers found beside their wagons, lips cracked, tongues swollen, canteens bone dry. Some people never made it past their first week out there, not because they weren't brave, but because they underestimated thirst. The land itself was the enemy. For miles upon miles, you could ride and see nothing but dry brush and parched earth. Rivers were rare, and many dried up completely by midsummer. Wells were unreliable, and the few that existed often turned bitter or poisoned. Settlers would sometimes dig and dig until their hands bled, only to hit nothing but rock. When a trickle finally came, it might taste metallic or foul, filled with silt or worse disease. Yet they drank it anyway, because to hesitate was to die. Even stagnant water with a layer of green film was precious. They would strain it through cloth, boil it if they had the means, and pray it wouldn't kill them. Imagine walking through the wilderness with a single canteen sloshing softly at your side. Every drop is a decision. You sip too often, you run out too soon. You ration too tightly, and the heat weakens you before noon. The body begins to betray itself in the West. Your mouth turns dry first, then your tongue swells until it's hard to speak. Your skin burns under the sun, and your eyes blur with dust. When you finally find a stream, you drop to your knees, heart pounding, desperate. You drink without thinking, only to find the water salty or filled with parasites invisible to your tired eyes. For towns and settlements, the battle over water shaped everything. Wells were guarded like gold mines, and arguments over access could turn bloody. A man who poisoned a well, whether by accident or intent, could be lynched by morning. Water meant survival for livestock, crops, and families. Drought could destroy a community faster than any outlaw. Entire towns were abandoned after their wells ran dry, their streets left empty and echoing beneath the unforgiving sky. You can still find ghost towns in the desert today, places where the only sound is the wind sweeping through collapsed buildings, silent reminders of how fragile life was. The problem wasn't just scarcity, but the unpredictability of nature itself. One season could bring flash floods that swept away wagons and camps in minutes, followed by months of punishing drought. Settlers learned to collect rainwater in barrels when they could, but the West was stingy with its blessings. Even rain brought new dangers: contaminated runoff, dead animals in the streams, and the spread of waterborne illness. Typhoid, dysentery, and cholera were constant companions at the frontier. A single sip from the wrong puddle could end your life within days. Cowboys and travelers developed rituals around water. They'd share it carefully, passing canteens with respect as if handling something sacred. Horses drank before men. The animals were lifelines, and losing one to thirst meant walking through a desert that could easily kill you. At night, travelers would sometimes dig small holes in dry riverbeds, waiting for the faintest moisture to seep upward, a desperate trick that sometimes saved them and sometimes didn't. There are diaries from pioneers who wrote about licking dew from canvas tents at dawn, just to feel the wetness on their tongues. And then there were the mirages, the cruel illusions that appeared in the heat-shimmering lakes that danced in the distance, always moving just out of reach. Countless wanderers chased those ghostly pools until they collapsed, realizing too late that the mind was playing tricks in the shimmering air. Even the most seasoned riders could be fooled by the promise of blue on the horizon. Hope itself could be deadly. In settlements, water was often rationed with strict discipline. Women used the same basin for washing clothes, dishes, and sometimes even children, in that order. Bathing was rare and often shared. The leftover water, grimy and gray, might be poured over a garden or used to cool down a tired animal. Nothing was wasted. The smell of unwashed bodies wasn't offensive, was ordinary, the scent of survival. Clean water was a luxury reserved for the sick, the newborn, or the dying. Those who came from cities back east couldn't understand how relentless thirst could feel until they lived it. The West didn't forgive ignorance. You learned quickly, or you didn't last. Every gulp was earned, every drop respected. It's easy to imagine yourself as tough enough to handle it, to believe you'd endure the sun and the dust. But as the day stretches on, the horizon's still empty, your throat burns, and your strength fades. The Wild West doesn't need bullets to kill you. It only needs the silence of a dry wind and a sky that never rains. Out here, thirst isn't just a discomfort. It's a haunting presence that follows you everywhere, whispering with every breath of dust. In the Wild West, the problem with water wasn't just finding it. It was keeping enough of it to see another dawn. By the time dawn has stretched across the dry plains and the sun begins to climb, the people of the Wild West are already hungry. Not the casual kind of hunger that waits politely for a meal, but the deep, gnawing ache of a body that works harder than it eats. Breakfast in the frontier wasn't a feast, it was fuel. And even that was often scarce. You ate what you had, not what you wanted, and you learned quickly that comfort was a thing best left in the cities back east. For most, The day began with the smell of smoke and bacon fat. Not the thick, tender slices you know today, but salty, stringy cuts preserved for months in barrels. The bacon sizzled over a small fire built from whatever wood or dried cow chips you could find. If you were lucky, you had a cast iron pan, blackened from use, heavy as a stone, but worth its weight in gold. Into it went bacon grease, then flour and water, stirred into a paste to make something resembling biscuits or griddle cakes. They were rough, dense, and barely leavened, but they filled the stomach and kept you standing. The meal might be washed down with coffee, if you could call it that. Out here, coffee grounds were reused over and over again until the drink turned gray and weak. When beans ran out, settlers roasted chicory, cornmeal, or even acorns to make something bitter and dark enough to trick the mind into believing it was coffee. Sugar was rare, and milk even rarer. Most drank it black, hot, and thick enough to coat the tongue. The caffeine was less important than the warmth. It woke you up, reminded you that you were still alive, and for a brief moment gave you a taste of civilization. Hardtack was another staple, those rock-hard crackers that could last for years if kept dry. They were simple: flour, salt, water, and nothing else. Many travelers and soldiers soaked them in coffee or bacon grease just to soften the bite. Some joked that hardtack was more useful as a weapon than as food. But when you were 100 miles from the nearest town, you didn't complain. You chewed until your jaw ached and swallowed dust disguised as breakfast. For cowboys and ranch hands, breakfast was eaten quickly, often before sunrise. Work started early, and the cook, often called the cookie, was the most important man in camp after the trail boss. He rose before everyone else, stirring fires in the dark, brewing gallons of coffee in blackened pots, and frying up whatever meat he could find. The chuck wagon was his kingdom, a rolling kitchen filled with sacks of beans, bacon, flour, and lard. A good cook could make even the worst ingredients taste like home, and a bad one could sour an entire crew's mood for weeks. Meals weren't about pleasure. They were about survival and morale. Beans, bacon, and biscuits, those were the holy trinity of frontier food. Some added molasses when they could, others a bit of dried fruit. Fresh eggs and milk were treasures, usually reserved for families on homesteads who kept a few chickens or a cow. But in the harshest stretches of the West, even that was rare. Instead, people made do with salted beef, dried apples, and canned peaches luxuries shipped westward by rail or wagon. Every bite was hard-earned, every ingredient precious. The air around a campfire carried a mix of scents, smoke, grease, and dust. People sat quietly, boots planted firmly in the dirt, hats tipped low, chewing slowly as the world brightened. Conversation was minimal. In that silence, you could hear everything: the faint clatter of tin plates, the hiss of the fire, the far-off cry of a coyote. Breakfast wasn't about leisure. It was about gathering enough strength to endure the next 12 hours of work under an unrelenting sun. In towns, breakfast could be a touch more civilized if you could afford it. A saloon or boarding house might serve biscuits and gravy, flapjacks, or fried potatoes. For a few cents more, you could have fresh eggs or ham. But even these luxuries carried risk. The food was often spoiled or undercooked, and many a traveler fell sick from a bad meal. Milk could sour overnight, and butter melted before noon. Hygiene was an afterthought, and no one had the time or tools to make things clean. You ate, you hoped, and you went on. For families on homesteads, breakfast was a communal ritual, short but meaningful. Women cooked over open flames, stirring pots with wooden spoons worn smooth from years of use. Children fetched water or wood, while fathers repaired tools and harnesses. The table, if there was one, was often just a few planks nailed together, surrounded by mismatched chairs or crates. They'd eat quickly, sharing whatever they had: cornbread, salt pork, or leftover stew from the night before, and then head straight into a day that wouldn't slow down until sunset. What made breakfast in the frontier remarkable wasn't its taste, but its persistence. No matter how harsh the conditions, people made time to eat together, even briefly. In a world of uncertainty, that morning meal offered a rhythm, a reminder that life still had order. The act of eating, however humble, was defiance a way of saying, "We're still here. We made it through the night." It's easy to romanticize that life from a distance, to imagine the smell of campfire coffee and the glow of dawn over endless plains. But sitting there, with dust in your teeth and heat already pressing on your skin, you'd quickly realize the truth. There was no comfort, no ease, just the steady, unending work of staying alive. Breakfast in the Wild West wasn't the beginning of a peaceful day. It was the first small battle in a war that never really ended. Travel in the Wild West was not a matter of choice. It was a matter of necessity, and it was always dangerous. The land itself seemed determined to test you, to wear you down, to remind you that civilization was still only a rumor out here. Whether you were on horseback, in a creaking wagon, or walking beside a trail that stretched endlessly toward the horizon, every mile carried risk. A single mistake could mean death, not in an instant, but slowly, quietly, under the watch of a sun that didn't care. Imagine stepping out onto a dusty trail before sunrise, the light just beginning to spill over the landscape. The air is cool, but that won't last long. You have a long way to go, maybe to the next settlement, maybe toward a mining town where rumor says there's work, maybe toward nothing at all. You check your supplies. A few pounds of jerky, a canteen half full, some beans, a knife, and your horse. If you're lucky enough to have a wagon, you also have a spare wheel, a handful of nails, and faith that the wood won't splinter before you reach your destination. Then you start moving. Slowly, carefully, because out here, everything breaks eventually. The roads of the West weren't really roads at all. They were ruts carved by the wagons that came before you, uneven, rocky, and treacherous. In dry weather, they filled with choking dust. In rain, they turned to rivers of mud. Wheels cracked, axles snapped, and horses stumbled. Many travelers carried spare parts, but not everyone was so prepared. A broken wheel miles from help could mean the end. Some settlers abandoned their wagons entirely, taking what they could carry and walking into the unknown, hoping to find water or shelter before exhaustion claimed them. Then there were the bandits. Outlaws roamed the lonely trails like ghosts, waiting for travelers too confident or too desperate to stay armed. They would appear from nowhere, faces half-covered, rifles raised, voices calm but cold. You could lose everything in seconds. Your food, your horse, your money, and sometimes your life. The Wild West wasn't a place of endless duels and noble standoffs. Most violence happened without warning and without reason. A stranger on the road was as likely to rob you as to help you. But even if you escaped people, nature had its own arsenal. Blinding sandstorms could sweep across the plains without warning, tearing tents from the ground and suffocating travelers in waves of dust. The sky would darken, the wind would scream, and the world would turn brown and airless. Those who survived learned to drop to the ground, cover their mouths with cloth, and wait for hours until the storm passed. Then there were the flash floods, sudden torrents that poured through dry canyons and riverbeds, sweeping away wagons, animals, and people before they had time to shout. You could die of thirst one day and drown the next. The nights brought their own dangers. Coyotes and wolves watched from the shadows, their eyes glinting in the firelight. Mountain lions stalked the edges of camps. Rattlesnakes coiled in the warmth of a campfire's dying embers, silent and patient. Travelers learned to shake their boots in the morning before putting them on, to check blankets and saddles for surprises that could end a day's journey before it began. Insects carried disease, scorpions lurked beneath rocks, and the desert itself seemed alive with things that wanted you gone. If you were lucky enough to travel by stagecoach, you traded one kind of danger for another. Stagecoaches rattled across impossible terrain, their wooden wheels striking rocks, their passengers tossed like rag dolls. The ride was bone-shaking and relentless. The air inside smelled of sweat, leather, and fear. Dust poured in through every crack. The driver sat exposed, reins in hand, eyes scanning for signs of trouble-broken bridges, washed-out trails, or a distant glint of rifles. Robberies were so common that passengers often carried small sums of money to hand over quickly, hoping it would be enough to satisfy the men on horseback. But the worst enemy of all was the distance itself. The Wild West was vast beyond comprehension. The horizon always seemed to move further away as you approached it. Days blurred together under the unchanging sky. You began to measure time by the shadows your horse cast, by the number of times you stopped to water the animals, by the stars that came out one by one each night. Loneliness crept in slowly, whispering doubts as you rode. Were you still on the right trail? Was there even a town ahead? Many lost their way entirely, wandering for days before collapsing where they stood, their bones later found bleached and silent. Yet people kept traveling, because they had to, because the promise of something better, land, work, gold, or a new start was stronger than fear. They hitched their wagons, saddled their horses, and kept moving westward into a world that swallowed the weak and tested the strong. Travel here wasn't just a physical journey. It was a test of the soul. Every mile was earned with sweat, blood, and exhaustion. If you tried to travel like they did today, even for a single day, the Wild West would break you. The sun would burn you, the trail would betray you, and the silence would unsettle you in ways no noise ever could. Out here, there were no guarantees. Only the road ahead, the sound of your boots on hard ground, and the endless question echoing in your mind, will you make it to nightfall? When people imagine the Wild West, they often picture the gunfighter, the lone figure standing in the street at high noon, hand hovering over a revolver, dust swirling around his boots. The crowd holds its breath. A shot rings out. One man falls. The other holsters his gun and walks away. But that clean, dramatic version of violence is a myth. The real Wild West was not about honor or duels. It was about desperation, fear, and survival. The law was often a rumor, and justice depended on who had the faster trigger finger or the bigger gang behind him. In truth, most towns in the early frontier had little or no law enforcement at all. Sheriffs were rare, deputies even rarer, and courtrooms nearly non-existent. When a new settlement sprang up around a mine or along a cattle trail, it might take months or years before anyone official arrived. Until then, people made their own rules. Some formed vigilante groups, others hired gunmen to protect what they owned. A man's reputation was as valuable as his weapon. If others believed you were dangerous, you didn't need to prove it often. Towns like Dodge City, Deadwood, and Tombstone earned their reputations for chaos, but they weren't alone. Every boom town, every railroad stop had its share of brawls, robberies, and murders. Saloons were the heartbeat of these places, crowded, smoky, loud, and dangerous. Gambling tables clattered with cards and coins, whiskey sloshed in tin cups, and tempers rose fast. Many fights started over nothing. A spilled drink, a cheating hand, a careless glance. A moment later, a chair would crash, a pistol would flash, and someone would be lying on the floor. There were no police to call, no medics rushing in. You dragged the body outside, covered it with a tarp, and someone else sat down to finish their drink. But for all the stories of famous gunfights, the truth was less cinematic. Most killings didn't happen face to face in the street. They happened in alleys, from behind doors, or miles from town on lonely trails. Guns were tools, not symbols. They were used to settle debts, defend property, or make sure you got the last word. Many men carried revolvers not because they wanted to fight, but because they knew everyone else did. Even the calmest townsfolk slept with a weapon nearby. Out here, hesitation was the most dangerous habit of all. Sheriffs and marshals, when they did exist, had impossible jobs. They were outnumbered, underpaid, and often unpopular. Some were brave, others corrupt, most simply tired. A good lawman could keep order with his presence alone, but he knew the peace would never last. Arresting an outlaw might earn him a bullet the next day, or revenge from the man's friends. Trials were rare, and prisons were temporary. A rope tied to a tree served as judge and jury more often than any courthouse. Justice, if you could call it that, was quick and brutal. For settlers and families, this lawlessness created constant fear. Every sound outside at night made your heart race. The creak of a door, the distant bark of a dog, it all carried possibility. Was it a traveler, a thief, or something worse? People built their homes small and strong, windows narrow, doors reinforced. They slept light, one hand close to a gun or knife. Children learned early to stay quiet when strangers came by. There were no second chances out here. Trust could get you killed. The violence wasn't always between men with guns. Disputes over land, water, and livestock often turned deadly. A misplaced fence, a stolen cow, a dried-up well, any of these could spark bloodshed. Families feuded for generations. The land was too vast, and the law too distant to intervene. Even when order began to creep westward, it came slowly, carried by railroads and telegraphs, by men in dusty suits who claimed to represent civilization. But out here, civilization was fragile. It cracked easily under the weight of hunger and heat. And yet, for all the chaos, there was a strange kind of balance. People depended on one another more than they admitted. The same saloon that saw fights by night might serve as a courtroom by day. The same man who drew his gun in anger might be the one who saved your life a week later. Survival forged uneasy alliances. Everyone understood that too much bloodshed could destroy a town faster than any drought. Lawlessness was dangerous, but it was also predictable. You learned to read people's tempers, to sense trouble before it began, to walk away when you could. Gunsmoke was part of the air itself. It clung to the streets, to the walls of saloons, to the clothes of every man and woman who called this place home. It smelled of fear, of sweat, of whiskey, of the thin line between living and dying. Violence was not constant, but it was always near waiting, like the dust, to rise with the wind. If you found yourself in the Wild West, you might think you could handle it, that you'd keep your head down, stay out of trouble, and mind your own business. But trouble had a way of finding people here. You could lose everything in the time it takes to draw breath. The gun on your hip wasn't power. It was insurance, a fragile promise that maybe, just maybe, you'd survive another day in a land where law was nothing more than a suggestion written in the dust. If you rode into a frontier town after days of travel across the barren plains, it might seem like a miracle at first. You'd spot the low buildings rising from the dust-wooden walls, bleached gray by the sun, tin roofs glinting faintly in the light. A few figures would move about, leading mules or carrying buckets. Smoke might curl lazily from a chimney. After endless emptiness, this little patch of noise and movement felt like civilization. But step closer, and you'd see it for what it really was, a fragile temporary oasis clinging to the edge of nowhere. The main street of a Wild West town was usually a single strip of dirt lined with false-fronted buildings, saloons, general stores, a blacksmith, maybe a post office, and if you were lucky, a church or a small school. Horses were tied outside on rough-hewn posts, and the air buzzed with flies. Dust hung thick in the sunlight, stirred by every bootstep and wagon wheel. You could hear the creak of a swinging sign, the jangle of spurs, the low hum of voices from behind the saloon doors. It wasn't glamorous. It was raw and alive, a place where everyone was trying to build a life before the desert took it back. If you walked through town, you'd pass the blacksmith first shirtless in the heat, hammer ringing against iron, sparks flying like fireflies. His forge was the heart of every settlement, for without tools and horseshoes, nothing else worked. The smell of scorched metal mingled with that of manure and stale whiskey from next door. Across the street might be the general store, its shelves stacked with precious things: coffee, sugar, flour, nails, bullets, and bolts of cloth. The owner, usually a man with tired eyes and a revolver under the counter, kept careful watch on every transaction. Credit was rare, and debts were dangerous. Out here, people remembered who owed what. The saloon, though, that was the true center of the town. Its doors never stayed closed for long. Inside, the air was dim and heavy, filled with the sounds of clinking glasses, muttered conversation, and the occasional sharp crack of laughter. Card games ran from dawn till dark, and the whiskey poured freely, watered down but still enough to blur the edges of another hard day. Men leaned against the bar, talking about cattle drives, mining claims, or the latest trouble on the outskirts of town. Women worked there too, some serving drinks, others offering company for a price. Life in the saloon was rough, but it was also a kind of escape, a chance to forget how hard the world outside really was. Children ran barefoot through the streets, their faces streaked with dust, their laughter echoing between the wooden walls. They played with sticks and stones, chased chickens, or sat on porches listening to adults talk. School, if it existed, was often held in a single room where one teacher managed every age and subject. Lessons were short, interrupted by chores or by parents who needed their children's help on the homestead. Still, in those brief moments of quiet, when chalk scraped against a worn blackboard, the dream of a better future flickered to life. At night, lanterns glowed through thin curtains, and the town took on a different kind of beauty. The streets were quieter, the heat finally easing. Someone might play a fiddle on a porch, the notes carrying softly through the still air. Dogs barked, doors creaked, and laughter drifted from the saloon. It was a fragile peace, but peace nonetheless. For a few hours, before the next day's labor began, people allowed themselves to rest, to pretend that this place, this town of wood and dust, could last forever. But behind the warmth and small joys, danger was never far. A fire could start with a single spark, and since everything was made of dry timber, the whole town could vanish in minutes. Disease spread quickly, too, carried by travelers or the contaminated water that everyone shared. Without doctors or clean supplies, even a simple fever could take lives. And then there was the violence, the sudden brawls, the drunken gunfire, the grudges that simmered until they boiled over in the middle of the street. Every town had its dark stories, whispered long after sunset. Still, people kept coming. They came for gold, for work, for freedom, or simply for the chance to start again. Each person brought their own piece of the world, an accent, a recipe, a prayer, and together they made something strange and new. You could walk down a single street and hear a dozen languages. You could find a church sermon in the morning and a knife fight that night. The West didn't belong to anyone. It borrowed from everyone. For women, life in a frontier town was especially demanding. They cooked, cleaned, raised children, and often helped run businesses or farms. Some found themselves running boarding houses or laundries, working from dawn to dark just to make enough to survive. Others performed on stage in the saloon, or worked behind closed doors where the nights felt longer and heavier. Yet even in hardship, there was resilience. Women wrote letters home, kept journals, and built communities when men were too restless or lost to do so. Their quiet strength held these towns together in ways history often forgets. If you stood at the edge of one of these towns at sunset, you'd see a strange contrast. The land stretched out endlessly, wild and untamed, while behind you flickered the faint lights of human effort, small, stubborn, and defiant. Each lantern, each voice, was a promise whispered against the dark, that life could exist here, even if only for a while. Life in a frontier town was hard, dirty, and uncertain, but it was also alive, pulsing with determination. Every nail hammered, every seed planted, every meal shared, it all meant something. These were people building the bones of a future they would never see, laying down roots in soil that refused to nurture them. And when morning came, they would rise again, brush the dust from their faces, and start all over, because that's what the West demanded. Persistence, even when the world around you tried to erase you. In the Wild West, illness was a shadow that followed every man, woman, and child. It crept quietly into cabins, wagons, and tents, striking without warning and leaving devastation in its wake. Out here, on the very edge of civilization, sickness didn't just mean discomfort. It often meant death. A fever could claim you in a week. An infected cut could end your life in days. There were no hospitals, no real doctors for hundreds of miles, and medicine was a matter of luck, superstition, or stubborn endurance. Most frontier towns had one person who called themselves a doctor, but their training, if any, was questionable. Some had studied medicine back east. Others had simply watched someone else do it once and decided to try. Their bags carried the essentials: morphine, laudanum, whiskey, a bone saw, and thread for stitching wounds. Antiseptics were scarce, and hygiene was an afterthought. Instruments were used again and again, often rinsed in dirty water between patients. The result was predictable. Infections spread faster than they could be treated, and small injuries became fatal far too often. If you caught a fever on the frontier, you were told to rest and drink water, if any was clean enough to be found. Families wrapped loved ones in damp cloths, prayed through the night, and waited. The heat of summer made every illness worse, and flies carried disease from one cabin to another. A simple cold could turn into pneumonia. A toothache could become blood poisoning. Every cough, every wound, every ache carried a quiet fear behind it. You learned not to complain too much, because there was no real help to be found. The most dreaded diseases were the ones that moved quickly: cholera, dysentery, typhoid, and smallpox. They swept through camps and towns like wildfires, taking dozens at a time. When cholera struck, the symptoms were brutal: vomiting, fever, and dehydration that drained the body until only silence remained. Entire wagon trains were lost to it before reaching their destinations. Survivors buried their dead in shallow graves beside the trail, too weak to dig deep. The earth of the West is filled with those forgotten mounds marked by stones or by nothing at all. Smallpox was the most feared of all. Its arrival could turn a thriving settlement into a ghost town within weeks. Faces once familiar became unrecognizable, covered in painful sores. Those who survived carried the scars forever. Some towns tried to isolate the sick in barns or abandoned shacks, but containment rarely worked. Without vaccines or proper sanitation, disease spread faster than rumor. Many fled at the first sign of illness, leaving behind homes, belongings, and neighbors. Survival often meant running away before the sickness reached your door. For women, childbirth was among the most dangerous experiences of all. There were no hospitals, no trained midwives in most places, just family members and neighbors doing their best. Complications were common, and without clean tools or proper care, infections took countless lives. A mother could bring new life into the world in the morning and be gone by nightfall. It was a cruel irony. The same act that built the frontier also destroyed so many who lived it. Widowers raised infants alone, or left them with others to care for while they worked to survive. The West was filled with loss that never made it into history books. And yet, people adapted. They turned to whatever remedies they could find. Herbal cures passed down from indigenous tribes saved many lives, though settlers rarely gave credit for that knowledge. They boiled bark, chewed bitter roots, and mixed herbs into teas that soothed fevers and pain. Whiskey was medicine to burning throats and numbing pain in equal measure. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, was used for everything from headaches to heartbreak. It dulled suffering, but brought addiction that no one yet understood. Morphine came later, offering the same false mercy in measured doses. When someone fell ill in a camp, others gathered close. They wiped sweat from brows, whispered prayers, and hoped for morning. The sound of coughing at night was haunting, the rasp of a life hanging in the balance. Sometimes there was recovery. More often, there was silence by dawn. Funerals were simple and swift. Wood was too valuable for coffins, so bodies were wrapped in blankets or canvas laid into the earth and marked with whatever could be found: a cross of sticks, a pile of stones, a name carved into the wood of a broken wagon wheel. Grief was constant, but quiet. Out here, people didn't have the luxury of mourning long. Disease didn't discriminate. It struck cowboys, miners, farmers, and children alike. It thrived where people gathered, whether in mining camps thick with smoke and sweat, or in the cramped wagons of settlers moving west. Travelers often carried sickness with them, spreading it unknowingly from one settlement to the next. Even animals weren't spared. Cattle fell ill, horses weakened, and food spoiled. The line between survival and disaster was always thin. And still, despite it all, life continued. People married, children were born, laughter returned between the bouts of illness and death. There was resilience in those who stayed alive, a quiet defiance that said, "Even sickness can't stop us." They built small hospitals when they could, trained midwives, and shared what little knowledge they had. Slowly, painfully, the frontier learned to heal itself. If you were to fall ill in the Wild West, you would discover quickly that the fight wasn't just against the sickness. It was against the isolation, the lack of comfort, and the helplessness of knowing no one could truly save you. The nearest doctor might be 50 miles away, and even if he came, he'd arrive too late, dusty and exhausted, his hands trembling from fatigue. The world was too vast and too harsh for mercy. Illness on the edge of civilization was a silent killer, invisible but ever present. It reminded everyone that no matter how strong or brave they were, the human body was fragile, and nature never stopped reminding them of that. Out here, you didn't fight disease, you endured it. You hoped to wake up in the morning, and if you did, you thanked the land for sparing you, just for one more day. Life in the Wild West was harsh for everyone, but for women, it demanded a kind of strength that went far beyond endurance. The frontier did not care about comfort, reputation, or expectation. It demanded survival. And women, though often overlooked in the tales of gunslingers and gold miners, were the quiet architects of that survival. They were the ones who held families together when the land seemed determined to break them apart, who faced childbirth without doctors, loneliness without rest, and danger without hesitation. Theirs was a story of grit told in silence, in calloused hands and sleepless nights. Most women who came west did not come chasing dreams of adventure. They came because someone else decided to go, a husband, a father, or a family desperate for land. They packed what they could into wagons: cooking pots, blankets, sewing needles, a Bible, maybe a photograph from home. Then they left behind everything they knew. For weeks, even months, they rode through landscapes that seemed endless, enduring dust storms, freezing nights, and hunger. And when they arrived, there was no welcome waiting, just a patch of wilderness and the expectation to make it home. A woman's work on the frontier never truly stopped. From before dawn until after dark, she labored cooking over open fires, hauling water from wells or streams, washing clothes by hand, tending to children, and caring for animals. She grew what she could from the dry soil, stitched torn clothes, and treated wounds when illness came. There was no such thing as rest and little room for complaint. Every day was a race against exhaustion, and every task a small act of defiance against the unforgiving land. In small towns, women became the backbone of communities. They ran boarding houses, laundries, and kitchens. They taught school to children of all ages, sometimes in rooms no bigger than a stable. They played the organ in churches, tended gardens, and organized gatherings that gave people a sense of belonging in a place that felt like nowhere. Many became healers or midwives, passing down herbal knowledge that saved lives when medicine was scarce. Others wrote letters home for those who couldn't read, or helped bury the dead when tragedy came, which it often did. And then there were the women who had no family to follow, those who made their own way west. They found work wherever they could, in saloons, in mining camps, in hotels, or on stage. Some became performers, singing and dancing to earn their keep. Others worked in ways that society refused to speak of, their labor as vital as any other, though often judged harshly by those who depended on it. They faced dangers of a different kind: exploitation, violence, and abandonment. But even so, many carved out small freedoms in a world that offered them almost none. On isolated homesteads, loneliness was a heavier burden than hunger. There were months where women saw no one outside their families, where silence became so deep it pressed on the mind like a weight. Letters took weeks or months to arrive, and many never did. Some women wrote diaries, filling pages with thoughts they could not say, aloud worries about crops, children, and the endless uncertainty of life on the edge of everything. In those faded words, still found in archives today, you can feel both the despair and the unshakable will to endure. Marriage on the frontier was often a partnership of survival. Love existed, yes, but so did necessity. Men depended on women for stability, for the quiet work that kept the world functioning. Without them, food wouldn't be cooked, clothes wouldn't be mended, and the sick would go untended. In turn, women relied on men for physical labor and protection in a landscape filled with risk. But despite this interdependence, women were far from powerless. Many managed property, ran farms, and made business decisions when their husbands were gone or after they died. In the absence of law or oversight, their authority often went unquestioned. And when danger came, and it always did, women faced it with the same resolve as any gunslinger. They stood guard at doors with rifles in hand, nursed the wounded, and protected their children from the wild. Stories survive of women who fought off bandits, chased away wolves, or rode through storms alone to find help. They didn't do it for glory. They did it because there was no one else to do it. The West didn't allow for hesitation or fear. It turned both men and women into survivors, hardened and unyielding. There were also women who defied every expectation, carving their names into history. Some became ranch owners, outlaws, or sharpshooters. Annie Oakley dazzled audiences with her skill, while Calamity Jane roamed the frontier as a scout, nurse, and storyteller. Others, less famous but no less brave, broke the mold, quietly refusing to be bound by the narrow roles society offered. They lived on their own terms, often scorned for it, but their independence became a symbol of what the frontier truly represented: freedom at a cost. Despite all the hardship, there were moments of peace. Evenings when women sat by flickering lanterns, mending clothes while the wind sighed outside. The smell of bread baking in a rough clay oven, the laughter of children playing with rag dolls, the comfort of a hymn sung softly before bed. These moments, fleeting but real, were the light that made everything bearable. In those small acts of normalcy, they built something stronger than walls or fences. They built a sense of home. If you were a woman in the Wild West, you learned early that survival wasn't about toughness alone. It was about adaptability, about facing every dawn with quiet determination. You didn't have the luxury of weakness. You held families together, tamed the wilderness, and carved civilization from raw earth. The men may have claimed the legends, but the women built the life that made those legends possible. In the end, the Wild West didn't belong to the loudest or the fastest. It belonged to those who refused to give up, no matter how hard the wind blew. The Wild West earned its name for a reason. It wasn't just the people who were untamed, it was the land itself. Nature ruled with absolute authority, and every creature, from the smallest scorpion to the largest bear, played by rules older than civilization. Humans were the intruders here, building small fires in a vast wilderness that could swallow them whole. The dangers weren't always visible, but they were constant. Every rustle in the dark, every howl in the night, reminded settlers that they were not alone and not in control. The first danger most travelers encountered wasn't a beast, but the land itself. The ground was hard, dry, and full of hidden traps. Cactus spines could pierce through boots, leaving infections that festered without medicine. Snakes lay coiled in the shade of rocks and wagon wheels, their patterns blending perfectly with the earth. A careless step could end a life. The rattlesnake, especially, was both feared and respected. Its rattle was a warning, a sound that froze men in place faster than any gunshot. Cowboys told stories of snakes coiling inside saddlebags, under blankets, even inside boots left out overnight. One bite, untreated, meant a slow death under the scorching sun. Scorpions and spiders were smaller, but just as deadly. They crept into bedrolls and clothing during the cool nights, seeking warmth. Their stings could cripple a man, and infections were common. Travelers learned to shake out everything before use, to turn their boots upside down, to lift blankets carefully, to move slowly, even when exhausted. A single mistake in the darkness could cost dearly. The Wild West didn't forgive carelessness. Predators roamed too, though they often preferred to avoid humans. Coyotes called to each other across the plains at night, their eerie howls echoing through the still air. Wolves followed wagon trains for days, waiting for an animal to fall behind or for scraps left by travelers. They were intelligent and patient. A lone wolf was a ghost in the brush. A pack was a storm that came with teeth and hunger. Farmers and ranchers feared for their livestock, waking to find sheep or calves torn apart at dawn. The loss of one animal could mean starvation for a family, so men stood guard through cold nights, rifles ready, eyes searching the darkness. Then there were the bears. In the mountain regions, especially near the Rockies or Sierra Nevada, the grizzly reigned as an unchallenged king. Enormous, cunning, and nearly impossible to kill, a grizzly could tear through a cabin wall if it smelled food inside. Hunters told tales of men dragged into the woods, of horses killed in a single swipe. Travelers carried guns not just for outlaws, but for what prowled unseen in the trees. The sheer size of the wilderness meant danger could come from any direction, often without warning. The crack of a branch or the flutter of a bird's wings could turn a calm evening into chaos. Even the sky posed threats. Lightning storms rolled over the plains with violent beauty bolts striking open ground, splitting trees and igniting brush fires that could sweep across miles. Winds howled, tearing roofs from cabins, while hail pelted the land like thrown stones. Dust storms rose from the desert, blotting out the sun until day turned to an orange-brown twilight. People wrapped scarves over their faces, covered water barrels, and prayed their homes would still be standing when the air cleared. Nature didn't need to hate you to kill you. It only needed to forget you were there. The insects were another silent torment. Mosquitoes carried sickness, while flies swarmed over food and wounds alike. Outbreaks of disease often began with a single bite. In summer, locusts darkened the skies, devouring crops in hours and leaving behind barren fields. The noise they made a dry, relentless buzz was maddening, like the sound of the world unraveling. Families watched entire seasons of work vanish beneath the wings of insects, powerless to stop it. Water, too, could betray you. Rivers that looked calm might hide deadly currents. Flash floods appeared without warning, washing away camps and wagons. In the deserts, mirages shimmered on the horizon, cruel illusions of salvation. A thirsty traveler could chase them for miles before collapsing in the sand, realizing too late that the promise of water had been nothing but air and light. Even when you found real water, it might bring death instead of relief filled with parasites, bacteria, or the decaying remains of animals that had reached it first. At night, the wilderness came alive in ways the eye could barely see. The air filled with sounds, the chirp of crickets, the cry of owls, the rustle of unseen movement in the brush. The darkness was total, so thick it felt like a living thing pressing against you. Campfires offered little comfort. They only reminded you how small your circle of safety really was. You might sit by the fire, staring into the flames, and feel eyes watching from just beyond the light. In the West, every sound had meaning. The crack of a twig could make your heart stop. The silence that followed could make it race again. And then, there were the less tangible dangers, the ones that lived inside the mind. Isolation could twist thoughts, turning every shadow into a threat. Men and women alike spoke of hearing voices in the wind or seeing figures in the distance that vanished when approached. Superstitions thrived here because logic offered no comfort. People believed the land itself was haunted by the dead, by spirits, by memories of all who had perished beneath its endless sky. Whether true or not, it made sense. The wilderness didn't just kill the body, it tested the spirit. To live among such dangers required more than courage. It required humility, a deep understanding that you were a guest in a land that belonged to no one. The settlers who survived learned to listen. To the wind, to the animals, to the silence itself. They built fences, but they never truly tamed the wild. The land always waited, patient and eternal, ready to reclaim what was borrowed. If you were to walk into that world now, you might find beauty first, the vastness, the golden light, the feeling of freedom. But give it time. Spend one night alone under that sky, and you'd understand what those settlers knew. The West was alive. It watched, it listened, and it reminded you with every sound and shadow that survival here wasn't a right. It was a privilege earned with every breath you dared to take. The Wild West was not just a landscape of open plains and endless skies. It was a meeting ground. Dozens of cultures, languages, and lives collided here, each fighting for survival, each believing they belonged. It was a land both vast and intimate, where encounters between strangers could decide the fate of generations. But where people met, conflict followed. The West was built on dreams, yes, but also on misunderstanding, greed, and blood. Before settlers arrived in great waves, the West was already home. Indigenous nations had lived there for thousands of years, each tribe with its own land, traditions, and rhythms. The plains, the deserts, the forests, they were not empty, but alive with stories and spirits. The Sioux, Apache, Navajo, Comanche, and countless others knew every river bend and mountain trail. They hunted buffalo, traded with neighbors, and honored the balance between earth and man. But when settlers came pushing westward, that balance shattered. The early encounters were uneasy, sometimes peaceful, often wary. Trade brought tools, blankets, and food in exchange for pelts and horses. There was curiosity on both sides and moments of fragile cooperation. But as more settlers arrived, bringing fences, guns, and hunger for land, fear turned to resentment. Promises made by the U.S. government were broken again and again, treaties signed and forgotten as soon as new gold was found or new land was desired. What followed was not a single war, but a series of them, small, brutal, and constant. Each side fought for its own version of survival. For settlers, the frontier seemed endless, waiting to be claimed. But for indigenous nations, it was a slow invasion that consumed everything. The bison herds, once numbering in the millions, were hunted to near extinction by rail workers and trophy hunters. Rivers once clear grew muddy with runoff from mining and livestock. Sacred sites were trampled under wagon wheels. To the settlers, it was progress. To the people who already lived there, it was erasure. Travelers on the frontier knew that every meeting could turn tense. A rider approaching on the horizon might be friend or foe. You wouldn't know until they were close enough to see your eyes. Miscommunication was common, especially when language failed. A gesture meant to show peace could be mistaken for aggression. Guns stayed close to hand, even during trade. Fear made everyone dangerous. And yet, amid the chaos, moments of respect endured two groups, sharing food by a campfire. A gift of water offered on a blistering day, a nod of understanding across the divide. Conflict wasn't only between settlers and indigenous nations. The West was a patchwork of rivalries, miners against ranchers, ranchers against farmers, lawmen against outlaws, and even towns against each other. The discovery of gold or silver could turn friends into enemies overnight. Miners claimed land and water rights with guns, not paper. Ranchers fought over grazing routes, cutting each other's fences under cover of night. Feuds smoldered for years, fueled by pride and scarcity. The West had room for everyone, but never enough of anything. Racial tension also shaped the frontier in ways often forgotten. Chinese laborers who built railroads and toiled in mines faced brutal discrimination. They worked the hardest jobs for the least pay, often in isolation, targeted by anger they did nothing to cause. African Americans, both freedmen and former soldiers, known as Buffalo Soldiers, served in cavalry units, defending settlers and building forts. But even in uniform, they faced prejudice from the very people they protected. The West promised freedom, but delivered it unevenly. Even among settlers themselves, division was constant. Immigrants from Europe brought their languages and customs, clashing with neighbors from the East. Religions mixed uneasily, and moral codes shifted depending on the town. A preacher might share a street with a gambler, a widow with a gunman. The frontier didn't erase differences, it magnified them, forcing people together in ways civilization back east could never imagine. You learned to tolerate, to negotiate, or to fight. Violence became a kind of language. Raids, ambushes, and revenge killings stained the soil. The newspapers back east turned these tragedies into legends, heroes, and villains cast in simple colors. But the truth was murkier. Many who fought did so out of desperation, not hatred. The settler defending his homestead and the warrior protecting his hunting ground were reflections of each other, both caught in a storm of change too big to stop. Yet even in the midst of violence, moments of peace persisted. There were marriages between settlers and native people, alliances formed out of necessity, and friendships born in defiance of the times. Some soldiers went native, abandoning their posts to live among tribes they had once been ordered to fight. Some indigenous guides led wagon trains safely through their lands, knowing that not everyone who came west carried malice. The frontier was not just a story of conflict, it was also one of unlikely coexistence, of humanity glimpsed between the gunshots. As the decades passed, the wars slowed but never truly ended. The railroads came, bringing more settlers, more towns, and more destruction. The great nations of the plains were forced onto reservations, their way of life fading like smoke in the wind. The settlers, for all their triumph, lost something too, the sense of awe and humility that once came from facing a land that could not be tamed. The West was conquered, but at a cost no one could fully count. If you were to walk through that time, you'd see it not as good versus evil, but as survival versus survival. Every group, every person, was trying to hold on to something precious, their land, their culture, their dignity, their hope. The encounters that shaped the West were not just battles of bullets, but of identity and belonging. The echoes of those conflicts still linger in the wind that crosses the plains, carrying whispers of voices that refuse to be forgotten. The Wild West was not simply wild because of its lawlessness. It was wild because it was alive with struggle, with the clash of worlds old and new. And in that struggle, beneath the violence and the loss, was something profoundly human. The endless fight to exist, to endure, and to be remembered. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon in the Wild West, it didn't feel like the day was ending. It felt like the land was holding its breath. The heat lingered for a while, hovering above the ground before the desert cold swept in like a tide. The sky deepened into indigo, and one by one, the stars appeared so many that it was almost overwhelming. If you'd never seen a sky that dark, you might think you'd wandered into another world. Out here, with no city lights to dull it, the heavens felt alive. For travelers and settlers alike, sleeping under the stars wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. Cabins were rare, beds even rarer. You slept where you could, beside a dying fire, inside a wagon, or on the bare ground wrapped in a thin blanket. The night air was sharp, and the earth was cold. Sometimes you could hear the hiss of wind through dry grass, or the distant cry of a coyote calling to its kin. It wasn't peaceful in the way you might imagine. It was a fragile kind of stillness, filled with sounds that reminded you how exposed you truly were. The first challenge was warmth. The temperature dropped fast once the sun was gone, especially in the open plains and deserts. Campfires burned low, wood too scarce to waste. Cowboys on cattle drives would sleep in their coats, hats pulled low, hands tucked beneath their arms. Their blankets were heavy with dust and the smell of smoke, and they learned to sleep lightly, always half awake. The horses stood nearby, shifting occasionally, their silhouettes ghostly in the starlight. If one neighed or startled, every man sat up instantly, reaching for his rifle. Night was when danger liked to move. For those traveling by wagon, nights were both beautiful and brutal. Families huddled together for warmth, children falling asleep to the crackle of the fire and the whisper of wind against canvas. Parents whispered in low voices, counting supplies, planning the next day's journey. Sleep was shallow and often interrupted by cold, by fear, by the uneasy knowledge that tomorrow would bring more miles of hard road. Still, there was a strange comfort in lying beneath that endless sky, as if the stars themselves were keeping watch. In mining camps, sleep came as exhaustion, not rest. Men crawled into tents or dugouts after 14 hours of back-breaking labor, their bodies sore and lungs filled with dust. The ground was hard, the air heavy with the scent of sweat and iron. Some fell asleep before they even finished eating, their dreams haunted by gold that always seemed just one shovel deeper. The nights that were filled with snores, coughs, and the occasional muffled argument, small sounds swallowed quickly by the vast silence outside. On ranches, the nights stretched differently. The wind rustled through the grasslands, carrying the low murmurs of cattle. A hand on night watch might ride slowly around the herd, listening for the telltale signs of restlessness that meant a stampede could start at any moment. A sudden noise, a rattlesnake, a flash of lightning, or even a coyote's howl could send hundreds of animals running, and the cowboys would have to chase them for miles in the dark, shouting, whistling, praying to bring them back before dawn. For them, sleep was a luxury measured in snatched moments and brief dreams under the stars. Despite the hardship, there was something about those nights that lingered in memory. The stars in the Wild West weren't just lights, they were companions. They gave direction when maps failed, told the time when clocks were broken, and provided a sense of scale in a world that often felt too big to comprehend. Men and women lying in the dust could look up and feel, for a brief moment, connected to something eternal. The same constellations that guided travelers thousands of years before guided them now. In that infinite sky, their struggles seemed smaller, but also more meaningful. The sounds of the night became part of the rhythm of life. The crack of cooling stones, the soft shuffle of horses, the sigh of the wind through sagebrush, it was a kind of music, a song of endurance. Sometimes someone might hum quietly, an old tune carried from far away, blending with the sound of the fire. Others simply lay still, staring upward, thinking of home, of the people they'd left behind, or of nothing at all. Out here, under the stars, thoughts drifted as freely as the wind. But the night also carried danger. Coyotes prowled close to the edge of camps, their glowing eyes reflecting firelight. Wolves howled in the distance, a reminder that civilization was fragile and far away. Rattlesnakes slithered silently near the warmth of dying fires, and insects bit through blankets. Sometimes the night grew too quiet, and every instinct told you to wake up, to listen. The wilderness was alive, and it never slept. For settlers who managed to build cabins, sleeping indoors offered little more comfort. Roofs leaked, the wind whistled through cracks in the walls, and the sounds of the wild still carried through the night. The darkness was absolute once the lanterns went out. You could almost feel it pressing against the thin walls, as if the night itself were alive and listening. Still, a roof meant safety psychological, if not always physical, and that was worth everything. There were few luxuries in the Wild West, but one of them was the view at midnight. On clear nights, the Milky Way cut across the sky like a river of light. The moon bathed the landscape in silver, transforming dust and rock into something almost holy. You could see for miles and miles, and yet, somehow, it made you feel smaller, not larger. In that vast silence, every worry, every danger, every hardship seemed to fade into the background. The night had a way of softening the edges of suffering, if only for a few hours. Sleep in the Wild West wasn't restful. It was survival. It came in fits and starts, broken by cold, fear, or the distant sound of hooves. And yet, it was also sacred, a moment when even the hardest souls could let go of the day and surrender to the rhythm of nature. Under those stars, with the fire fading and the wind whispering over the plains, every man and woman knew their place in the great, indifferent beauty of the West. If you ever found yourself there, lying beneath that vast sky, you'd understand what they felt. The loneliness, yes, but also the peace. The realization that, for all the struggle and danger, there was something profoundly beautiful about sleeping under the stars, in a world so large it could swallow you whole, and yet, somehow, make you feel like you belonged to it. The word cowboy carries an air of adventure, of freedom, of riding through open country beneath a golden sky. But in the real Wild West, the life of a cowboy was not glamorous. It was relentless, dirty, exhausting work, the kind that broke men's bodies and tested their spirits. A myth of the cowboy was born later, polished into legend. In truth, these were laborers on horseback, driven by duty, hunger, and the promise of a few dollars at the end of the trail. Their days were long, their nights were cold, and the land they crossed cared nothing for their courage. Cattle drives were the heartbeat of the frontier economy. After the Civil War, demand for beef in the growing cities back east turned the open plains into a moving marketplace. Ranchers in Texas, Kansas, and the Dakota Territory gathered wild longhorns tough, lean animals that could survive where few others could, and drove them hundreds of miles to the nearest railhead. The journey could take months, stretching across rivers, deserts, and endless prairie. It was one of the hardest jobs in the West, and yet for many, it was the only one available. A typical day on a cattle drive began before dawn. The cookie, was up first, lighting the fire and brewing coffee strong enough to wake the dead. The men ate quickly, beans, bacon, and biscuits, the same meal they'd have again at night. Then came the sound of leather creaking, spurs jingling, and quiet curses as men saddled their horses in the dark. The cattle stirred restlessly nearby, a sea of horns and lowing voices. By first light, The herd began to move, and the long day began. Each cowboy had a position in the herd. Point riders led from the front, guiding direction and pace. Flank riders kept the sides steady, preventing animals from breaking away. Drag riders brought up the rear, choking on dust for miles at a time. It was grueling work 10, 12, even 16 hours a day in the saddle, the sun beating down until it felt like it might peel the skin from your neck. The air was filled with dust, the smell of sweat and manure, and the constant low rumble of hooves. Talking was rare. Everyone knew their part, and every man understood how quickly things could go wrong. A stampede was the cowboy's greatest fear. It could start from anything: a clap of thunder, a sudden noise, even a flash of lightning. In seconds, 1,000 cattle could turn into a roaring river of panic, charging blind through the dark. Cowboys would leap onto their horses, shouting, waving hats, firing pistols into the air, doing anything to turn the herd before it destroyed itself. Men were trampled, bones shattered, horses killed. When it was over, if it ended, silence would fall heavy as ash. The survivors would look out at the torn ground, the broken bodies, and say nothing. Then they'd saddle up again and keep riding. There was no time for mourning on the trail. The monotony was almost as dangerous as the chaos. Long stretches of open land could stretch the mind thin. The sound of hooves and the swing of the saddle became hypnotic. Some cowboys sang to keep themselves awake, low, slow tunes that carried over the herd. These cowboy songs weren't about heroism. They were about home, loneliness, and the endless road. They were lullabies for the animals and for the men who missed the sound of a human voice. The rhythm of those songs still echoes in old Western music today. Food was plain and repetitive, and hygiene was nearly non-existent. Bathing was a luxury you could only afford if you crossed a river and had time to spare. Clothes were stiff with sweat and dirt, boots rubbed raw against skin, and the constant chafing of the saddle left its mark. Insects bit constantly, and the smell of cattle clung to everything. At night, the men slept in their clothes, hats pulled low, rifles within reach. The stars were their only roof. Rain meant misery-wet blankets, shivering horses, and the endless squelch of mud beneath every step. Despite the hardship, the cowboy life held a strange kind of pride. There was freedom in the work, a sense of space and motion that few other jobs offered. A cowboy could ride for miles without seeing another soul, surrounded only by sky and wind. For many, that solitude was worth everything. The camaraderie on the trail was strong too, forged in hardship. You depended on the man beside you with your life, and he depended on you. Arguments were rare, because grudges didn't last long in a world where death could come from the next bad storm. The dangers were constant. Rivers had to be crossed, and more than one man drowned when his horse slipped on a hidden current. Rattlesnakes waited near watering holes, and quicksand could swallow an animal whole. Lightning storms were deadly, striking the tallest thing on the open plain, which was often a man on horseback. Heat stroke and exhaustion claimed their share too, as did rustlers' bandits who stole cattle under cover of darkness. Every trail had its ghosts, men who had vanished into the land without a trace. And then there were the paydays, few and far between. A cowboy might work a drive for months and earn little more than $30 or $40. When the herd reached the railhead and the job was finally done, the men rode into town with their wages burning holes in their pockets. Saloons filled overnight music, laughter, and whiskey spilling into the dusty streets. By morning, most of that hard-earned money was gone. Some spent it on food, clothes, or letters home. Others lost it to cards, drink, or fleeting company. And when the next drive came, they signed up again, because that was the life they knew. The cowboy's world was fleeting. As the railroads expanded and barbed wire carved up the open range, the great cattle drives began to fade. The endless frontier shrank, the trails closed, and the sound of hooves gave way to the whistle of trains. But for a few decades, those riders lived a life that would become legend, a life of exhaustion and beauty, of danger and freedom, all under the same endless sky. If you tried to live that life now, even for one day, you'd understand what they endured. The aching muscles, the burning sun, the loneliness, the quiet satisfaction of seeing the herd moving steady and strong beneath your watch. The cowboy's life was one of survival, yes, but also of dignity. It was hard, unforgiving, and honest. Each day began with the rising dust and ended beneath the stars, with men too tired to dream. And in the silence that followed, as the cattle slept and the wind sighed across the plains, there was a peace only those who'd lived it could ever truly understand. If the cattle drives were the arteries of the Wild West, the mining towns were its beating, heart-loud, chaotic, and pulsing with desperation. Gold and silver were the great temptations of the 19th century, shimmering promises that drew thousands westward from every corner of the world. Men left families, countries, and sanity behind in pursuit of riches that most would never find. What they discovered instead was a world of mud, smoke, danger, and disappointment, a world that glittered on the surface but reeked of hardship underneath. The first thing you'd notice walking into a mining town wasn't the gold. It was the noise. The clang of hammers on stone, the groan of wooden carts, the rhythmic thud of picks striking rock. The air was thick with dust, filling every breath, coating skin and clothing until everything turned the same dull gray. Camps sprang up overnight, tents and shacks crowding together on barren slopes. Men from every nation worked side by side, each believing the next strike might be theirs. It was a world fueled by hope and crushed by reality. Conditions in the mines were brutal. The shafts were dark, cramped, and airless. Candles flickered weakly in the damp, and the constant echo of digging never stopped. Men worked 12, sometimes 16 hours a day, swinging picks until their hands bled. The deeper they dug, the hotter and more dangerous it became. Wooden supports creaked ominously, and the earth itself seemed to groan. Cave-ins were common, and explosions from poorly handled dynamite could wipe out entire crews. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky ones suffocated slowly, trapped beneath tons of rock, while their friends listened helplessly from above. The dust they breathed carried its own curse. Silica filled the lungs, turning them stiff as stone over time. The men called it miner's lung, though it was really a slow suffocation that could take years. Coughs became constant, nights sleepless, and strength faded until even breathing was a labor. There were no doctors to help, only whiskey to dull the pain. Yet every morning they went back underground. The hope of one good find, just one glimmer of gold, was enough to keep them going. Above ground, life was little better. Mining towns were raw and lawless, thrown together faster than they could be tamed. Streets were muddy when it rained and dusty when it didn't. The smell of unwashed bodies, spilled liquor, and horse manure hung in the air. Saloons outnumbered schools, and gamblers outnumbered preachers. Every payday brought chaos. Miners stumbling out of shafts with pockets full of gold dust, eager to spend it before someone else took it. Saloons filled with shouting, cards slapped against tables, and bottles shattered on the floor. Fights were frequent, and gunfire wasn't rare. In the flickering light of oil lamps, fortunes changed hands as fast as they were made. Women were few, and their lives were difficult. Some worked as cooks, laundresses, or innkeepers, holding fragile order together. Others worked in saloons or brothels, where survival came at a steep price. The towns were rough, and kindness was scarce. Yet, amid the chaos, some women found ways to thrive owning businesses, managing supplies, and even staking mining claims of their own. They were tough, practical, and often more respected than the men who swaggered through town with guns on their hips. Law in these towns was more suggestion than structure. A single marshal might be tasked with keeping thousands in check. Justice was swift and rarely fair. A man accused of theft or cheating at cards could find himself staring at a rope before nightfall. Bodies were buried quickly, graves marked with simple wooden crosses if at all. By morning, the same streets would be full again, as if nothing had happened. Life was cheap and time moved fast. But not everything was violence and greed. There were moments of humanity amid the harshness. Miners sang while they worked old songs from Ireland, China, Mexico, and the American South. Around campfires at night, they told stories, shared food, and laughed about dreams they all knew would likely never come true. They built small churches and schools, started families, and planted gardens that struggled against the rocky soil. The West had a way of grinding people down, but it also forged bonds between those who endured it together. The boon never lasted. Every mining town was built on borrowed time. When the vein ran dry or the ore thinned out, people packed up and moved on overnight. Streets once filled with noise fell silent. Doors swung in the wind, and the smell of smoke and sweat faded into memory. These ghost towns, scattered across the West, still stand today empty shells of ambition and failure, their wooden signs bleached by sun, their wells long dry. If you walk through one, you can still feel the weight of the lives left behind, still hear the faint echo of hammers and laughter in the wind. For every man who struck it rich, hundreds lost everything. Some died in the mines, others in the saloons, and many simply disappeared into the endless wilderness. Yet, even knowing the odds, they came. Because the dream of the West was irresistible, the idea that fortune could be waiting just beneath your feet if only you dug deep enough. That dream built towns, destroyed lives, and fueled legends. If you stood in a mining camp at sunset, watching the light fade over the mountains, you'd see tired men stumbling toward their tents, faces black with dust, eyes red from strain. You'd smell smoke and hear the faint strains of a fiddle somewhere in the dark. And you'd understand that this place, for all its hardship, was alive with the stubborn heartbeat of hope. It was a world where men gambled their lives for glittering dust, and most of them lost. But for those who stayed, who believed, who kept swinging their picks even when their bodies broke, the West was more than a dream. It was a test of the human spirit itself. The Wild West was a place built on sweat and dust, and both carried death in their wake. The same earth that gave life to crops, the same dust that hung in the air like a veil, also ate invisible killers. In the frontier towns and on the open trails, disease was as constant as the wind. It crept through camps, homes, and saloons with quiet persistence. You couldn't see it, couldn't always understand it, but everyone feared it. And no matter how tough or clever you were, the West's filth and fever didn't care. Hygiene, as we think of it today, barely existed. Water was scarce and precious, reserved for drinking before washing. Bathing was rare, sometimes once a week, more often once a month. People wore the same clothes until they stiffened with dirt and sweat. The dust of the plains coated everything: hair, skin, food, and bedding. Flies swarmed without mercy, crawling across faces and into food bowls. The air itself felt thick with the weight of living too close to the ground. And from that dust came sickness slow, patient, and inescapable. Cholera was one of the worst. It spread through contaminated water, striking fast and killing faster. One drink from a tainted well or stream could bring hours of agony. Stomach cramps twisted the body, dehydration shriveled it, and by morning the victim was often gone. Wagon trains traveling westward left, behind trail after trail of shallow graves, each marked with a simple stone, each another lesson in how unforgiving the land could be. Entire families vanished between rivers, their names remembered only in the journals of survivors. Typhoid followed the same paths. It came from poor sanitation, from food touched by unwashed hands or water carried in filthy buckets. It started with fever, then delirium, then silence. Dysentery spread even faster, especially in camps and crowded towns. No one spoke of it openly. It was too humiliating, but everyone knew its signs. It left people weak and hollow, unable to stand, unable to fight. It wasn't the kind of death sung about in songs. It was the quiet kind, the kind that claimed people too tired to keep resisting. In the mining towns, lung diseases were a constant curse. Dust from the shafts filled the air, fine as smoke, coating the lungs in layers of grit. The men coughed constantly, spitting black phlegm onto the ground, their chests rattling with every breath. Some called it miner's consumption. Others simply called it the price of gold. Tuberculosis, known as consumption, also stalked the frontier. It passed easily from person to person, spreading in cramped rooms and crowded saloons. There was no cure, only time. The infected wasted away slowly, coughing blood into handkerchiefs, fading like candlelight in the wind. But the dust didn't just attack the lungs, it carried infection to every part of life. Wounds, even small ones, became dangerous. A splinter, a blister, a scratch from a rusty nail any could turn into a festering sore. Without clean water or antiseptics, infections spread quickly. Skin darkened, fever rose, and soon the smell of decay filled the room. Amputation was the only hope, performed by men with dull knives and whiskey for anesthetic. Many didn't survive the shock. Those who did carried the scars for life, reminders of a land that demanded a piece of everyone who tried to tame it. The women suffered in silence too, their health worn thin by childbirth, malnutrition, and exhaustion. With no proper sanitation and no doctors nearby, infections after childbirth were tragically common. Fevers burned through homesteads, leaving infants crying beside mothers who could no longer wake. The strength of those women was legendary, but even legends couldn't fight the invisible enemies that lived in the dust and dirt. Pests made things worse. Rats carried disease through every settlement, crawling across food stores and sleeping quarters. Fleas and lice infested clothing and hair, spreading typhus. Bedbugs thrived in the cracks of wooden bunks, biting through the night. The frontier's promise of freedom came with 1,000 small torments, each one reminding its settlers that nature could not be outsmarted, only endured. People did what they could with what they had. They boiled water when possible, burned rags, and used vinegar or whiskey to clean wounds. Herbs were gathered and crushed into pastes, and poultices were made from bark and clay. Indigenous peoples shared remedies that saved countless lives, plants that eased fever, soothed pain, or stopped bleeding. But even with these small miracles, death was never far. The line between sickness and health was thin, drawn in dust and luck. The smell of sickness was something everyone recognized, a sour, heavy scent that clung to air and skin alike. In homes and cabins, it mixed with the odors of smoke, animals, and sweat. When someone fell ill, curtains were drawn, lamps dimmed, and prayers whispered. Sometimes the patient recovered. More often, the silence grew too deep. Then came the digging, the steady scrape of a shovel in dry earth, the slow toll of grief that had no time to rest before the next loss. And yet, life went on. People learned to live with disease as part of existence, just another hardship in a land full of them. A fever could take your neighbor one week and leave you standing the next. You didn't ask why, you simply carried on. The survivors buried their dead, washed their hands in the same water, and went back to work. There was no choice. When you imagine the Wild West, it's easy to think of gunfights, saloons, and dusty trails. But the true battles were fought in silence, in shacks where mothers held feverish children, in camps where men coughed themselves into graves, in towns where the smell of sickness never really faded. The dust carried more than grit. It carried death, and those who lived through it carried something else, an understanding that survival wasn't about strength alone. It was about enduring the unseen, the endless war against a world that refused to be clean. If you ever found yourself there, walking through a dusty town under the relentless sun, you might not notice the danger at first. The laughter, the music, the smell of cooking might seem normal. But in every corner, behind every door, sickness would be waiting patient, invisible, and certain. In the West, death didn't always come with a gun. Sometimes it came softly, carried on the wind. Of all the hardships that defined life in the Wild West, the heat, the hunger, the danger, none were as relentless or as quiet as loneliness. It was a weight that settled on every soul who came west, heavier than any saddle or shovel. The land itself seemed to breed isolation. Vast, open plains stretched endlessly in every direction, and silence filled the spaces between. There were days when the only sounds were the wind through dry grass and the echo of your own footsteps. You could go weeks without hearing another voice. The West had many ways to kill a person, but the loneliness worked slowest and cut deepest. The frontier was not crowded with people, but with distance. Towns were scattered like islands across an ocean of dust, sometimes 100 miles apart. A journey between them could take days, sometimes weeks, with no guarantee of shelter or company. Travelers rode for hours with only their thoughts for conversation, the creak of leather and the rhythm of hooves becoming their closest companions. Even when you reached a settlement, it didn't always bring comfort. Everyone was too busy surviving to linger long and talk. People greeted each other briefly, traded goods or news, and went back to work. Connections were fleeting, and friendships often ended with the next wagon headed east or further into the wild. For settlers, loneliness began the day the wagon stopped, and the work of building a home began. Imagine standing in the middle of an empty prairie, the horizon stretching endlessly around you. The nearest neighbor might be 10 miles away. When night fell, there were no street lamps, no voices, no signs of life beyond the glow of your own fire. The silence was total. Even the wind seemed hesitant to break it. Families huddled together in small cabins, listening to the sounds of the land, the creak of wood, the cry of coyotes, the beating of their own hearts. The stars were vast, cold witnesses to the small flicker of human life below. For many, especially women left alone while men worked long hours or traveled, the isolation became unbearable. Days bled together into a blur of chores and silence. Letters from family took months to arrive, if they came at all. Some women wrote diaries, their words quiet prayers to a world that would never answer. Others spoke to themselves, just to remember what a voice sounded like. There are accounts of settlers who went mad from the loneliness, wandering into the open plains and never returning. The frontier could take your life, but it could also take your mind. Men on the trail faced a different kind of solitude. Cowboys spent weeks riding the range with nothing but cattle and sky for company. They sang to the herd to fill the emptiness, their songs carried by the wind like confessions. The silence between those songs was enormous, a silence that swallowed laughter, that made a man feel both infinite and invisible. Some found peace in it, others found despair. The stars above, magnificent as they were, reminded you how small you truly were. Out there, the world didn't care if you lived or died. In mining towns and camps, the loneliness took a louder form. The saloons, filled with laughter and music, were desperate attempts to fight the silence that waited outside. Men drank not just to forget hardship, but to drown the echo of their own thoughts. The flicker of lanterns, the clatter of cards, the sound of a piano, they were all defenses against the darkness pressing in. But even surrounded by people, you could feel alone. Every man was there for himself, every woman guarding her heart. Companionship came and went like dust in the wind, and when the music stopped, the loneliness came roaring back. The winters made it worse. Snow trapped families inside cabins for weeks, sometimes months. Food grew scarce, tempers short. The cold was so deep it made the air ring in your ears. People spoke less, moved less, conserving energy as if words themselves were rationed. In those endless nights, when the fire burned low and the wind howled outside, even the strongest souls could feel something inside them start to crack. The silence became a living thing, an uninvited guest that sat with you, slept beside you, whispered your fears back to you in the dark. For those who lost loved ones, loneliness became permanent. Graves dotted the land, small and quiet, each one a story left unfinished. Widows tended to children and farms with trembling hands. Men carried on without wives, speaking to their ghosts while they worked the fields. Death was constant, but grief had no outlet. There were no churches nearby, no gatherings, no comforting words. You learned to bury not just your dead, but your sorrow too. To keep moving was the only way to survive. And yet there was a strange beauty in the solitude. The land was vast enough to make you humble, to strip away the noise of the world. There were moments watching the sunrise spill gold across the prairie, or hearing your horse breathe softly in the cold dawn, when loneliness felt almost sacred. It reminded people that they were part of something greater than themselves, something ancient and indifferent. The West was not a place for those who needed company. It was for those who could find peace in their own thoughts, who could listen to the silence without being consumed by it. Letters were a lifeline. A single piece of paper, carried across hundreds of miles, could bring tears to the eyes of the toughest man. The handwriting of someone loved, the scent of home still clinging faintly to the page, it was enough to keep hope alive for another season. Reading those words by lantern light, people remembered they were not forgotten. And when they wrote back, they poured everything into those pages: news, longing, apologies, dreams. The ink became their voice in a world too quiet for comfort. If you lived in the Wild West, loneliness would not just visit you, it would become part of you. It would shape your thoughts, your habits, your prayers. You would learn to talk to the sky, to the wind, to the land itself, and sometimes it might even feel like it answered. The people who survived here were not just strong in body. They were strong in solitude. They learned how to live with silence, how to make peace with it, how to find a kind of calm inside it. The loneliness of the frontier was both a burden and a teacher. It broke some, but it also forged others into something unshakable. Out there, beneath that vast, indifferent sky, you came to understand the truth of the West, that in the end, you stood alone, but in that aloneness, you discovered who you truly were. If the people of the Wild West feared anything more than guns, disease, or outlaws, it was the weather. The land could be cruel, but the sky was merciless. It could bless you with rain one hour and destroy your world the next. The weather out here didn't follow rules. It came without warning, without pity, and without memory. It didn't care about your plans, your crops, or your children sleeping inside. It simply came, and when it did, it reminded everyone who truly ruled the frontier. The mornings often began deceptively calm. The sun would rise in a quiet blaze, lighting the plains with a soft gold that made everything look peaceful. But that calm was always temporary. Out here, the air could change in a moment. The wind would shift, and you could feel the charge in the air, the way the land seemed to hold its breath. Then, like a living creature waking up angry, the weather would turn. Storms rolled over the horizon with a roar that could shake the ground. The light would vanish, swallowed by walls of gray and brown, and the wind would begin to scream. Dust storms were the West's most common terror. They rose like waves, devouring everything in their path. The air turned thick, and the sky darkened until day became night. The wind whipped sand and grit into the eyes, the skin, the lungs. Horses panicked, wagons overturned, and travelers clung to whatever shelter they could find. People wrapped scarves over their faces, breathing through fabric and praying it would end quickly. But the storms could last for hours, even days, leaving behind dunes where roads once lay and burying tools, wagons, and sometimes the people themselves. When it was over, silence returned, but it wasn't peace. It was the stunned quiet of those who had survived. And then there were the rains or the lack of them. Drought was the true killer of the West. It came slowly, stealthily, draining life from the land a little at a time. The earth cracked and split open. Wells ran dry, and livestock dropped where they stood. Crops withered into brittle stalks, and families watched the work of entire seasons vanish under the unrelenting sun. The sky turned a pale, endless blue, mocking those who begged for clouds. There were prayers, rain dances, offerings, and hope, but the sky did not listen. Those who stayed too long learned the taste of dust as surely as bread. When the rain did come, it often came all at once. Flash floods were another of nature's cruel jokes. Dry riverbeds that hadn't seen water in months could fill in minutes, surging with violent, muddy torrents. Camps, wagons, and even small homes were swept away before anyone could react. The sound was monstrous, a roaring wall of water, carrying branches, stones, and the debris of lives caught unprepared. The land seemed to take back what little humanity had built, as if reminding them that it had only ever been borrowed. The winters were no kinder. Snow came thick and fast across the northern plains, blanketing everything in white silence. The wind cut through clothing like knives, and the cold burned the skin until it turned numb. Fires struggled to stay lit, and food grew scarce. Travelers who underestimated the cold simply vanished, their bodies found months later when the thaw came. In mountain passes, blizzards could bury entire wagon trains. The snow fell so heavy that sound itself disappeared, leaving only the eerie whistle of the wind. To be caught in such a storm was to feel utterly alone in a world of white and death. Even those who had shelter suffered. Cabins weren't built to keep out the chill. The wind found every crack, every loose plank, and poured through. Families huddled together under blankets, listening to the moan of the wind and the creak of the roof. The fire became the center of everything, the source of light, heat, and sanity. If it went out, the cold would creep in fast, and hope would leave with it. People learned to measure time by firelight, by how long it took for frost to bloom on the inside of their windows. Every morning that came without loss was a small miracle. Spring was supposed to bring relief, but it came with its own fury. The melting snow swelled rivers to bursting, and thunderstorms rolled across the plains like battles between gods. Lightning split the sky, striking trees, wagons, and sometimes people. Thunder shook the ground, echoing for miles. The storms were beautiful, in a way majestic, untamed, but they were also deadly. Fires spread easily, set off by lightning or carelessness, turning dry fields into infernos that raced faster than horses could run. Entire towns burned to the ground in a single night, the flames painting the horizon in terrible orange light. The people who lived through these tempests learned humility. You couldn't fight the weather. You could only endure it. They read the sky like scripture, watching clouds for signs of change, feeling the wind for shifts in mood. They built their homes low and strong, their windows small, their faith deep. Every season carried danger, but also beauty. The same sun that scorched the land painted it in gold at dawn. The same snow that buried lives also gave water to spring crops. To live in the Wild West was to exist in a constant balance between awe and fear. There was something almost spiritual in that relationship. The people didn't curse the sky for long. They couldn't afford to. They learned to see its power as part of the rhythm of life. When the storms passed and the air turned still, they would step outside, faces lit by the pale glow of a new dawn. The land would look cleansed, the air crisp, the sky impossibly wide. For a brief moment, peace returned. And then, quietly, they went back to work repairing fences, rebuilding roofs, planting again. If you found yourself there, standing in the middle of the frontier with the wind rising and the sky darkening, you'd understand why so many people spoke of the weather as if it were alive. You'd feel the raw force of it, the indifference, the wildness. You'd realize how small you truly were. In the Wild West, the weather wasn't background, it was character. It could nourish you, destroy you, or test you until nothing remained but your will to keep standing beneath that endless, ever-changing sky. Violence was woven into the fabric of the Wild West, not as something exceptional, but as something ordinary and inevitable. It was part of the landscape, as natural as the wind and as unrelenting as the dust. People came to the frontier chasing freedom, fortune, or redemption, but the West had its own rules. Out here, survival depended on strength, and strength often meant the willingness to harm or to be harmed. Yet the cost of that violence ran deep, far beyond the gunfire and blood. It changed people, eroded their softness, and left scars that lingered long after the echo of the last shot faded into the hills. A gun was as common as a tool. Every man carried one, and most women knew how to use one too. It wasn't for show. It was necessity. Danger came from every direction: wild animals, bandits, desperate travelers, and sometimes even neighbors. But the constant presence of weapons did something to the human spirit. It made people wary, coiled tight like snakes ready to strike. Words were chosen carefully, movements watched closely. A wrong glance, a muttered insult, could turn into blood on the ground before anyone had time to intervene. Fear was a kind of etiquette, keeping peace where law could not. The newspapers and dime novels later turned these moments into legend duels at high noon, noble sheriffs, and infamous outlaws. But the truth was uglier. Most killings didn't happen in showdowns under the open sky. They happened in shadows, in back alleys, in drunken fights inside saloons. They were messy, impulsive, and often senseless. A man could die over a card game, a horse, or a drink spilled on his boots. And when he did, there was rarely justice. Sometimes the killer fled, sometimes he stayed, shrugged, and bought another round. The law was thin in those lands, and the graves were many. Even those tasked with upholding order were not immune. Sheriffs and marshals were few, and most were outnumbered. They carried the weight of impossible responsibility, keeping peace in towns where every man carried a weapon and every argument carried history. To hold authority here was to invite death. A badge didn't mean safety. It meant a target on your chest. Some wore it with pride, others with weary resignation. They buried friends, arrested neighbors, and sometimes, after too many years of blood, simply rode away without a word. The violence wasn't confined to gunfights. It lived in the daily struggle of existence. Settlers fought the land, fought hunger, fought each other for water and space. Ranchers clashed with farmers, miners with claim jumpers, and cattlemen with sheep herders. When words failed, and they often did, violence filled the silence. It was how disputes were settled in a place where courts were distant and patience was thin. Every graveyard in the West held the remains of arguments that ended too quickly. The Civil War had ended, but its ghosts wandered the plains. Many who came west were veterans, men who had seen too much death to fear it anymore. They carried their trauma quietly, but it surfaced in their tempers, their drinking, their sleeplessness. The West became a refuge for broken soldiers who didn't know how to return to peace. Out here, no one asked about the past. Violence was a language they already spoke fluently. It offered purpose, even when it destroyed them. And yet, the cost of that violence was immense, not just in bodies, but in spirit. Children grew up with gunfire as background noise. They learned early to duck when voices rose, to stay indoors after sundown. Women lived with the constant fear that every knock at the door might bring bad news. Families carried grief like another piece of luggage, too heavy to set down. The songs sung in the evenings carried loss between their lines. The ache of lives lived too fast, too hard, too violently. Even those who survived were never the same. The mind could only absorb so much death before it began to fray. Men who killed, whether by duty or by chance, carried that memory forever. Some drowned it in whiskey, some buried it under work, and some took to the wilderness, unable to live among others again. There are stories of outlaws who turned themselves in, not because they feared the gallows, but because they were tired of running from others, from their past, from themselves. The violence that had kept them alive had also hollowed them out. Communities bore those wounds, too. Towns that began as hopeful settlements often ended as haunted places. A single act of violence, a robbery gone wrong, a lynching, a massacre, could stain a place for generations. People moved on, buildings fell apart, but the stories remained, whispered like curses over campfires. The land itself seemed to remember. Travelers spoke of feeling unease in certain valleys, of hearing echoes where none should be. The West was vast, but its history was never truly buried. Not all violence came from malice. Some came from desperation, from hunger, from the unbearable weight of trying to survive in a place that offered no mercy. A man might steal a horse because his child was starving. A woman might kill a stranger because she had no other choice. Morality in the frontier was a shifting thing, like the desert sands. People did what they had to, and they carried the consequences in silence. Judgment belonged to no one, because everyone's hands were dirty. And yet, for all its brutality, violence was not without consequence. It burned the heart and wore down the soul. Those who lived long enough to grow old in the West often spoke softly, with eyes that saw too much. They didn't boast about the blood they'd spilled. They spoke instead of the quiet things, the sound of wind through grass, the sight of the first rain after a drought, the rare peace of a night without trouble. They had learned, painfully, that violence might keep you alive, but it also took pieces of you every time. If you were to live a single day in the Wild West, you might think you could handle the danger, the fights, the fear, the constant readiness. But by nightfall, you would understand. It wasn't the violence itself that would destroy you. It was what came after. The silence, the guilt, the faces that stayed in your mind long after the dust had settled. The true cost of the West wasn't measured in bullets or blood, but in the humanity it burned away. It was a place that taught you how to survive. Yes, but also how to forget what gentleness once felt like. By the late 1800s, the Wild West, the land of open ranges, lawless towns, and endless horizons began to change. The freedom that had drawn so many westward was fading, replaced by fences, railroads, and order. Civilization had finally caught up with the frontier, and though it brought comfort and connection, it also brought an ending. The Wild West, once wild in every sense, was slowly being tamed. But for those who had lived through its chaos and beauty, the end of that era felt like losing a part of themselves. The first blow came with the railroads. Iron tracks carved across the plains, connecting distant towns and shrinking the vast wilderness. Where once a journey took weeks by wagon, now it could be done in days. The great cattle drives ended as trains carried livestock more efficiently than any trail crew could. The open range, that endless stretch of freedom where cowboys had once roamed, became divided by barbed wire, a new invention that cut across the land and the old way of life. The plains that had seemed infinite now had boundaries, ownership, and laws. The cowboys who stayed on became ranch hands, their work confined, their world smaller than before. For the settlers, the railroads were salvation. They brought goods, tools, letters, and news from the east. Towns grew around the tracks, thriving with trade and opportunity. But progress was a double-edged sword. The same trains that carried supplies also carried the machinery of industry, the mining companies, the lumber mills, the bankers, and the law. The raw, untamed independence that defined the early pioneers was slowly replaced by structure and oversight. The West was no longer the land of anyone's making. It belonged increasingly to companies, politicians, and those who could afford to buy it. The indigenous nations suffered most in this new age. The wars and broken treaties of the decades before had already stripped them of their lands, but the final years of the century brought the last blows. The buffalo herds, once stretching across the horizon in numbers beyond counting, were nearly gone. Without them, the people who had lived alongside them for millennia were left starving and displaced. Reservations confined them to small patches of land, their freedom taken, their traditions suppressed. The songs that had once echoed across the plains grew quiet, drowned out by the whistle of trains and the hammering of rail spikes. The end of the West was not just the end of a way of life, it was the silencing of an entire world. The boom towns that had sprung up during the gold rush began to die as quickly as they had risen. When the mines ran dry, the people moved on, leaving behind hollow shells of towns' empty streets, sagging saloons, forgotten graves. The ghosts of those dreams lingered, haunting the wind that passed through broken windows. In some places, you could still hear the faint clang of a pickaxe or the echo of laughter that time refused to bury. The West didn't disappear overnight. It just faded, piece by piece, until only memory remained. Law and order, once a distant dream, became reality. Marshals gave way to sheriffs, sheriffs to city police. Schools were built, churches raised, roads paved. Civilization brought stability, but it also washed away the rough edges that had given the frontier its soul. The chaos that once defined life here was replaced by predictability, by schedules and boundaries. The gunslinger, the outlaw, the drifter, they became relics, replaced by farmers, merchants, and families seeking peace. The stories of those wilder days began to shift from reality into legend. By the turn of the century, the West existed more in memory than in truth. Writers back east began to romanticize it, spinning tales of bravery, adventure, and justice. The real hardships, the hunger, the fear, the blood, were softened into myth. The cowboy became a hero. The outlaw became a rogue. The brutality of survival was rewritten into a story of freedom and honor. The people who had lived it watched in silence, knowing that the world they had endured was being polished into something clean and unrecognizable. The Wild West was no longer a place. It was an idea, a story told to children and dreamers. For the old-timers who had lived through it, the change was bittersweet. They sat on porches of growing towns, watching trains pass and remembering when the land stretched forever. They told stories of dust storms and cattle drives, of gunfights and lost loves, their voices filled with both pride and sorrow. Some missed the danger, the freedom, the silence of open land. Others welcomed the comfort of peace, the steady rhythm of a world no longer on the brink. But all of them knew they had lived through something that would never come again. Nature, too, seemed quieter. The bison were nearly gone. Wolves, bears, and mountain lions retreated farther into the wilderness, hunted nearly to extinction. The land, once wild and unpredictable, now bore the marks of man-fences, fields, and telegraph lines stretching as far as the eye could see. The sky still held its vastness, but beneath it, the human world had claimed its dominion. The Wild West, untamed and indifferent, had become the American West civilized, divided, and owned. And yet, something of that spirit remained. In the wind that still swept across the plains, in the sun that still burned over red canyons, in the quiet moments when dusk fell over the desert and the stars returned, you could still feel it, the heartbeat of a world that refused to die completely. The West was changed, yes, but not gone. Its memory lived in the stories passed down through generations, in the bones of old cabins, in the rusted iron of forgotten tools, buried beneath the sand. If you stood there today, at the edge of that history, you might still hear the echoes, the creak of wagon wheels, the whistle of a faraway train, the faint murmur of voices carried on the breeze. The Wild West ended long ago, but its shadow lingers, long and eternal, across the face of the land. Because some places, once wild, never truly stop being so. They live on, not in the maps or the borders, but in the restless dream of freedom that still stirs in every human heart. The Wild West has always lived in our imagination as a place of freedom-wide skies, galloping horses, brave souls, and the promise of endless adventure. But as you've heard tonight, the truth was far more complicated. It was a land of extremes of beauty and brutality, of hope and heartbreak. Every breath, every sunrise, every small comfort came at a cost. Life in the West wasn't about glory. It was about endurance. It wasn't about legends. It was about survival. To live even a single day out there meant facing hunger, thirst, disease, and danger from every direction. The land itself was a challenge, its dust, its storms, its silence. There were no guarantees, no safety nets, no second chances. You lived by your hands, your instincts, and your luck. And most who came didn't find gold or glory, they found struggle. They found a kind of loneliness that stripped away everything soft and left only what was essential. The West didn't make people heroic. It made them human, tired, scarred, and real. But there was something deeply beautiful in that struggle too. In the courage to wake each morning, knowing how hard the day would be. In the small joys, warm coffee by a fire, the laughter of a friend, the cool relief of rain after months of dust. Those quiet moments, born out of hardship, are what kept people going. They remind us that even in the harshest conditions, the human spirit finds a way to endure, to adapt, and to hope. The myths of the Wild West may have softened with time, but the truth remains more powerful than legend. The people who lived and died there carved their stories into the land itself. And if you listen closely to the wind, to the silence, to the stars, you can still hear them. The whispers of a world that was wild, dangerous, and alive in every sense. So as the night settles around you and your eyes grow heavy, let your mind wander across those dusty plains once more. Imagine the crackle of the campfire, the creak of saddle leather, the endless sky filled with stars. You've walked through the heat and the hunger, the storms and the solitude. And though you might not have survived a day out there, you've felt its story, the weight and wonder of a time that shaped the soul of a nation. Before you drift off, take a moment to subscribe to Asterisk History for Sleep Asterisk. It helps keep this quiet corner of storytelling alive, where history can unfold gently while you rest. Tell me in the comments when you like to listen at night, during storms, or in the early calm of morning, and what time periods you'd like to dream through next. Thank you for traveling back with me tonight. Now close your eyes, let the past fade into silence, and rest easy beneath the stars of the old frontier. Good night, traveler, and sweet dreams from the Wild West.